I want this village Judenrein, which is German for free of Jews.
With these words shouted in 1939, Sel Hubert and his family were driven out of their home in the tiny village of Kronheim, Germany. Sel was 13, only a little older than these children at Rise Community Synagogue. His sister was 16. For hundreds of years, the Jews and Christians of Kronheim had lived peacefully together. But now Adolf Hitler was in power, and their lives were about to turn upside down.
So one day, we came to school in the morning, and as we were walking in through the door, we saw the other kids lined up on either side, and as we walked through, they suddenly started to hit us and spit on us and kick us. And the first thing we wanted to do is to say to the teacher, "Hey, stop this." And then we saw that was the teacher who was telling the kids what to do to us.
Sel's family was astonished, unable to believe how their village had turned on them. The Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of any rights, and now the hatred would blast right into their homes.
I'm sitting there having breakfast, minding my own business, when all of a sudden a brick comes flying through the window, and then another. And before I knew it, every window was being smashed. And there we were huddled upstairs, while about 4 or 5 men smashed their way into the house and broke the furniture and smashed everything they could get their hands on.
Afterwards, Sel and his mother began cleaning up the mess, and his very religious father went to recite his morning prayers.
Just then there was a knock on the broken front door. And when I answered, there was the mayor of the village and the chief of police. "We want to see Mr. Hubert, right now." So I called my dad out, and the chief of police said, "Mr. Hubert, you are under arrest. You will come with us."
Sel's father knew he had committed no crime. He was under arrest simply for being Jewish. The Nazis would take him by cattle car to Dachau concentration camp.
The mayor turned around and said, "And by the way, you will clear out of this village in 7 weeks.
What the Huberts didn't know was that Jews were suffering like this all over Germany that night. It was November 9th, 1938, the night the world would call Kristallnacht.
That was the beginning of the Holocaust, because it was the first time that the Germans, the Nazis, had an organized campaign against all the Jews in Germany and Austria.
Newspapers and radio around the world trumpeted the news of Hitler's actions, but the world turned a deaf ear, and Hitler was free to do whatever he wanted. Sel's mother was now desperate to get her family out of Germany. Like many Jews, the Huberts went to the American consulate, begging to be allowed to emigrate to the U.S. They were turned down. Miraculously, 5 weeks after his arrest, Sel's father reappeared at home.
Full of frostbites. He had been tortured. He was in bad shape.
They patched him up and scrambled to get out of Kronheim before the deadline the Nazis had imposed. Their relatives in the countryside offered their spare room, and the Huberts gratefully accepted. Every day was about survival.
As a child growing up under Hitler, I remember being afraid all the time, 24 hours a day, just being afraid that the Nazis could come in any time and harm us or arrest us or smash our house or kill us.
In the midst of the chaos, Sel's father remembered it was time for Sel's bar mitzvah. The Nazis had closed the town's synagogue, but coincidentally they allowed it to reopen just in time for Sel's big day.
Was your bar mitzvah joyful, or did the Nazis hamper your joy?
It was very little joy in my bar mitzvah. People that came from all around the area, mostly women and children, because most of the men were in concentration camp, and that's how I had my bar mitzvah. It was a very dramatic and traumatic experience. The conditions were so terrible, and we were all so afraid and horrified as to not only what happened in the past, but what's about to happen.
Sel relives his bar mitzvah every year by reciting his Torah portion at community synagogue.
Midor, dor. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu torat emet, v'chaye olam nata b'tochenu.
It reminds him of all it meant to enter Jewish manhood under Nazi rule, and of the spiritual strength he would need to get through the days ahead.
One day after the bar mitzvah, my parents got a letter from London in England, and it said, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Hubert, we are pleased to inform you that you may send a child to escape Germany to go to England."
The letter told them about the Kindertransport, England's effort to rescue Germany's Jewish children.
Why was the Kindertransport needed?
We had no choice. If America wouldn't take us and other countries wouldn't take us, my parents became very desperate.
News of the Kindertransport was wonderful and horrible at the same time. One of its rules was one child per family. The Huberts had 2 children.
How did your parents decide which child to send?
We sat around the kitchen table one evening, my mother, my father, my sister, and me, and we discussed which of the 2 should go on this first invitation. And it was decided that my sister should be the one, not because they loved her any more or any less than me, but because she was 3 years older than I, and they were hoping that she would be able to persuade another family in England to let me come out. She, being 16 years old, had a better chance of convincing someone than me, who was only 13.
And that's exactly what happened. One day, Sel received his own invitation to take the Kindertransport out of Germany.
Some of you may go away to summer camp, to sleepaway camp. And you remember when you go to the bus, your mom and dad come with you and you say goodbye to them. You know you're going to see them at the end of the 7-week period. You're even going to see them on Visitor's Day. But still, you feel kind of sad to say goodbye to them. When I said goodbye to my mother and my father, they knew and I knew that we would probably never see each other again.
Tearful parents stood on the train platform, waving goodbye to their children.
What were you feeling when you first stepped onto the train?
Here I was, a 13-year-old boy, going onto a train with other children who had just said goodbye to their parents. We didn't know where we were going to live. We knew we were going to England. We didn't know with whom we were going to live. We didn't know the language. We didn't know anything. We were going into a completely unknown world. And we were scared. We were petrified.
But the children did escape. The train took them to a ship which transported them to England. There they were matched up with English adults who pledged to care for them. Sel's sponsor was a Jewish woman named Mrs. King. 6 weeks later, as England was being drawn into the war, all school children were evacuated to the countryside. London was certain the Germans were about to drop bombs on them. In the countryside, Sel moved in with a Christian woman, Mrs. Stacy.
While you were living in England, how did you keep in contact with your parents and extended family?
At first, the first 6 weeks, we were able to write letters back and forth. And of course, we were worried about them, what was happening to them, and they were extremely worried about us.
And then the letter stopped. What was that like?
Once the war broke out, there couldn't be any more correspondence between countries that are at war. So the Red Cross allowed 25-word open postcard messages to be sent via Switzerland, and they were heavily censored on both ends.
But one day, Sel's postcard was returned, signed by someone else. He was told his parents had gone away. He never heard from them again. Later, the Red Cross told him his parents had died in a concentration camp. Another source told him they had been ordered off a train and shot. He will never know what really happened.
What do you accomplish by telling and talking about your story?
I think you can learn from my story of how terrible it is when people or whole countries become so prejudiced and become so bigoted that that can mushroom into wholesale murder. We are all basically God's children, and we have to live together and respect each other.
Today, both Sel and his sister live in the U.S. They were among the 10,000 children to have escaped the Nazis by Kindertransport. 1.5 million other children were killed in the Holocaust.